Hello Internet, and welcome to another episode of Furry Fandom Stories, where I take a look back at my own experiences within the fandom and like to comment on the more relevant topics floating around the fandom known as furry. To paraphrase Bob Chipman, comics are fucking weird.
Believe it or not, about 20 years ago, if you ever mentioned anything comic related, you were officially the dorkiest kid in school. However, since the year 2000, slick movies of comic-based properties were becoming the norm. Now, comic book fandom isn't just mainstream, it's become part of our modern culture. Even when the fandom was first starting to come together, they called themselves the Funny Animal Fandom, a name derived from the funny animal comic strips of the 50s and 60s. By the 1980s, Anthro artists, whom at first would just show their art at get-togethers at sci-fi cons, were drawing for small independent publishing houses and were able to present their talents to a wider audience. Soon enough, Anthro titles were being published, including titles like Usagi Yojimbo. Even when I first became active in the furry fandom, the first thing I did was read a whole lot of old Genus comics. This led me to others like Blotch's Dog's Days of Summer and other titles. Even if you go on Fur Affinity right now, you'll find artists that do their own comics. But I feel that there are Anthro comics by artists from outside the fandom that I think that furries should be more familiar with.
For the next couple of episodes of FFS, I'm going to share a couple of these titles with you. And today we're starting with the first graphic novel to win the Pulitzer Prize, Art Speigelman's Maus. And before I can actually talk about the graphic novel itself, we got to address the elephant in the room and why this title is considered controversial. Maus is set during the Holocaust.
When the Nazis came to power in Germany in 1933, one of the biggest ideologies they presented to the German people was the idea that certain political and ethnic groups were to blame for the country's shortcomings. Chief among them was Germany's defeat after the First World War. The blame for Germany's defeat would fall almost solely at the feet of Germany's Jews. The Reich's leadership then put into motion a plan to rid Germany of the Jews and other ethnic groups so that the fatherland would be kept ideologically and genetically pure, a final solution. But it wasn't just Jews who would suffer the horrors of the Holocaust. There were the political opponents of the Nazis, homosexuals who were forced to wear pink, pacifists, conscientious objectors, gypsies, Jehovah's Witnesses, the terminally sick, people suffering from mental disorders, the physically disabled, anybody who the Reich saw as a burden upon the Aryan race.
The horrors of the Holocaust were exposed to a wider world when British troops liberated the concentration camp at Belsen. American troops liberated the camps at Buchenwald and Dachau, and the Red Army liberating the camps at Treblinka and Auschwitz. Art Spiegelman's parents were Polish Jews who survived Auschwitz, and Maus tells their story. But Maus tells the story using anthropomorphic characters. The Jews are portrayed as mice, with cats representing the Nazis. Spiegelman himself has said when he first approached his publishers with the idea of Maus, they were understandably cautious, afraid that it would be seen as a joke in very bad taste. However, Art Spiegelman would go on to say that in Mein Kampf, Hitler himself describes the Jews of Europe as vermin, so Maus would be using Hitler's metaphor, not his own. Maus took over 8 years to complete, with Art Spiegelman trying to coax his father into remembering the past. The story itself is derived from over 30 hours of recorded tape conversations that Art Spiegelman had with his father Vladek, who died in 1982. He never saw the completed work. Maus itself is split up into 2 books. First, My Father Bleeds History, recounts Vladek Spiegelman's life from before the outbreak of World War II to his imprisonment in Auschwitz. Maus is told by a father mouse to his son, whom is anxious to hear the story of his parents' lives. Maus itself is set up in a triangle of towns in southwest Poland: Krakow, Katowice and Sosnowiec. In the first chapter, The Sheik, Vladek recalls a time when he had his first relationship with a woman who became strongly infatuated with him. However, the affair becomes unrequited when Vladek is introduced to his future wife Anya by his cousin. When Vladek Squeeze learns of this, she does not take it lightly and tries to break up Vladek and Anya. However, she is unsuccessful and the pair are married. In the second chapter, The Honeymoon, we see Vladek and Anya adjust to married life. And Anya gives birth to their first son, Rishu. Shortly after he is born, Anya is struck with a case of postnatal depression, and a doctor recommends that she be treated at a psychiatric hospital in Czechoslovakia. Whilst travelling there by train, Vladek and Anya look out a window and see a swastika flag from their train carriage. Vladek then recalls that he has heard some disturbing news from his relatives who have fled Germany. The Reich's hierarchy have made it clear that Jews were no longer welcome in the fatherland. Over the following year, there is news of anti-Jewish demonstrations and nationalist protests. The chapter ends with Vladek being given a notice from the Polish government. He's been drafted into the army. The third chapter, Prisoner of War, sees Vladek living the early days of the German invasion of Poland. Whilst out on a combat mission, his unit is overrun by Wehrmacht troops, and he and his fellow soldiers are captured and sent to a POW camp in Germany. Whilst at the POW camp, Vladek has a vivid dream where his grandfather tells him that he and his other prisoners of war will be released on the Saturday of Pascha's Truma. Before I go on, I think I should say that I am not a scholar on Judaism or Jewish tradition, but from what I've been managed to research, every Saturday Jews would read a specific verse from the Torah, which is called a Truma. The Pascha's Truma is the 19th Torah reading and is, if you want a Christian cross-reference, it's from the book of Exodus. It's when God is telling the Hebrews how to build the tabernacle. If you guys want to do some more involved reading, I left a link to the wiki article in the doodly-doo. So the Saturday when the Pascha's Truma is supposed to be read comes round and Vladek's dreams come true. He and his fellow soldiers are released. However, when on the train back to Poland, Vladek and the others realise it's not bound for Sosnowiec, it's bound for Lublin. You see, Sosnowiec was now in the part of Poland that was annexed to Germany, whilst the Vladek and the prisoners of war were being transported to the Protectorate Zone, which was the part of Poland that was in between the parts that were annexed between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. So after arriving in Lublin, Vladek and the other Polish soldiers are taken to a camp waiting to be processed. However, after being shot at one night by one of the guards, Vladek realises that something else is going on here. After getting some help from a friend of the family, Vladek escapes the camp and is smuggled aboard a train heading for Reich-controlled Poland, and he is soon reunited with his family. However, seeing as his hometown is in the Reich-controlled zone, things soon go from bad to worse. The News Titans revolves around Vladek recalling the grisly scenes under Nazi occupation, including public beatings and public hangings. Vladek and his family try to live as best they can, but it soon becomes clear that Sosnowiec is not the right place to raise a small child. By early 1942, the Spiegelmans are forcibly evicted from their homes and forced to live in another area of the town. By this time, the SS and the Gestapo were taking Jews and people of other ethnic groups off the streets and soon start taking them from their home. These people would soon be on their way to their camps. Paranoid that Gentile neighbours might turn them into the SS, Vladek and Anya start thinking about sending Rishu away to live with relatives. In August, the Jews of Sosnowiec were told to assemble in the local sports ground for document checking purposes. Those that had validated documents were allowed to return to their homes. Those that did not were soon on their way to the camps. Mousehole starts with Vladek not wanting to continue telling Art his story. This chapter includes one of Spiegelman's earlier works, Prisoner on the Hell Planet, a short comic strip he drew for Short Order Comics in 1972. Art Spiegelman had a mental breakdown whilst he was attending university and spent time in a mental hospital. When he was discharged, his mother Anya committed suicide, and Art Spiegelman tried to come to terms with his mother's death through his art. The fifth chapter focuses on the events when the Spiegelmans escaped to the Schrodula ghetto. Here, Vladek and Anya try to survive as best they can, and soon enough, the news of Auschwitz starts circulating. Vladek and Anya send their son away to the ghetto in Szarwice to live with friends of the family. Once there, the Gestapo and the SS begin to clear out the ghetto, and Rishu's foster mother poisons him, herself, and her entire family. back in Stradula, the transports to Auschwitz become more and more frequent. The final chapter of Book 1, Mousetrap, sees the Spiegelmans managing to escape the Stradula ghetto and going back to Sosnowiec, where they hope to go underground. However, this proved to be very dangerous, as people refuse to help them out of fear of what the Gestapo do to collaborators. In what seems like a massive stroke of luck, Vladek finds a man who claims to be a smuggler, and he claims that he can get him and Anya to Hungary. However, the man turns out to be an informant for the Gestapo, and Anya and Vladek are soon swiftly apprehended. They are then held in a prison for criminals and political prisoners awaiting transit to Auschwitz. When the Spiegelmans were sent from Bielsko to Auschwitz, they were sent there not as ordinary Jews, but as criminals. The Nazis considered criminals the more superior to the Jews. This would somewhat help them in the place where they would have to spend the rest of the war. And that's Mouse Book 1. Join us again for the next episode of FFS, where we have a look at the second book of Mouse, and here my troubles began. Remember, if you like the show, please remember to like, share and subscribe. You can follow me on Twitter at SandyBFox. I'm Frank Baldwin, aka Sandy Brushtail, and I will see you again for Mouse Book 2.